Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her when he passed her in the hallway outside room 347, his voice pitched low enough that she caught it, that particular blend of dismissal and contempt that had become the soundtrack to her 8 months at St. Michael's. Megan O'Brien didn't stop. Didn't turn. Didn't acknowledge the word settling like ash on her scrubs. They didn't know who was walking those corridors at 6:41 a.m. with her badge clipped to her collar and her hand steady as a surgical laser. They had no idea what scars ran beneath the sleeves of her standard-issue uniform. And that was exactly how the mission required it to stay. The third floor of St. Michael's Hospital in Atlanta hummed with the kind of controlled urgency that only comes from decades of machinery learning to sing in harmony. The ventilator in room 314 wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Monitors beeped in staggered syncopation. Rubber gloves snapped like gunshots in the silence of the medication room as Megan prepared the 7:38 a.m. rounds. The fluorescent lights overhead had a persistent hum that most people stopped hearing after the first week. She never stopped hearing it. At Kandahar Forward Operating Base Shank, the generators had hummed the same way, a constant reminder that civilization, even the fragment of it that existed in a reinforced concrete facility in Loga Province, required electricity and vigilance in equal measure. Here at St. Michael's, it was just background noise. Just the sound of a hospital breathing. 8 months. That's how long Megan had been working the ER day shift, and in that time she had established herself with the methodical precision of someone who understood that invisibility was a tactical advantage. The families called her competent. The patients called her when they needed something done without excuses. But administration, the hierarchy that actually mattered in the bureaucratic architecture of hospital operations, saw her as exactly what she had been designed to be: forgettable. Unremarkable. The kind of nurse you didn't remember the name of 3 hours after she'd checked your vitals and repositioned your fall line. Except Dr. Pierce remembered. He noticed things, though not in the way that mattered. The ER director had been auditing charts since 6:15 a.m., his office door opened just enough that Megan could see the glow of his monitor and the silhouette of his head bent forward like a vulture over a kill. He'd been making calls at odd hours. The kind of calls where voices dropped to whispers and then cut off the moment anyone walked past. Megan had learned in Ramadi that there were only 2 reasons people spoke like that: they were scared, or they had something to hide. Dr. Pierce didn't strike her as the type who scared easily. What scared him, she realized on her 4th week in the unit, was precision. He'd stopped in the med room on a Tuesday afternoon in November while she was reconciling the equipment logs, and she'd seen it in the micro-expression that flashed across his face when he noticed her work, the dates double-checked, the serial numbers verified against the physical equipment, a small notation in the margin where the charges from last month's billing didn't quite align with what had actually been used. It was the kind of discrepancy that shouldn't matter. That most nurses wouldn't notice. That Dr. Pierce had apparently been counting on no one noticing. "You're thorough," he'd said, and the way he said it was the way someone might compliment a guard dog before deciding it had to go. The morning stretched ahead of her in its usual rhythm: room 312, post-operative, stable; room 314, pneumonia, oxygen saturation holding at 91%; room 316, cardiac observation, vitals trending down slightly but nothing requiring intervention. She moved through the ward like water, finding its level, present but unobtrusive, her movements efficient and her presence easy to overlook. The other nurses had noticed her competence, certainly, but they had also noticed the way she asked clarifying questions about procedures, the way she read full charts instead of relying on the hand-off summaries, the way she documented everything in a detail that made most of them look like they were writing grocery lists. It was the kind of attention to detail that made people uncomfortable without quite knowing why. She was in room 318 checking on Mrs. Patricia Hawkins, an 83-year-old woman recovering from a hip replacement, when the new admission arrived. The stretcher came through the ER entrance at 7:38 a.m., preceded by a trauma unit that moved with the kind of urgency that made every monitor in the unit suddenly seem louder. Megan heard the commotion from down the hallway, voices elevated, equipment being positioned, the distinctive sound of a military-issued trauma kit being opened. "A Navy SEAL," someone said. "IED exposure. Traumatic brain injury." The words reached her while she was adjusting Mrs. Hawkins's compression stockings, and the room tilted slightly on its axis before settling back into place. She finished the task. She checked the fall line. She documented her observations in her neat, methodical script. And then she walked toward room 347 with the same unhurried pace she used for every patient assessment, because the alternative, running, showing anything that looked like urgency or recognition, would have meant compromising the reason she was here. The man in room 347 had hollow eyes. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the bandaging around his head, not the monitors tracking his neurological recovery, not the military escort stationed outside the door who'd briefed her in a voice that carried all the weight of official secrecy. The eyes. They were the eyes of someone whose mind had been shattered and then carefully glued back together by people who knew exactly where the pieces had come from but not necessarily where they were supposed to go. His name was stenciled on his chart as James Mitchell. Chief Petty Officer. Team 3. There was no indication, in any of the paperwork, that he'd been anywhere near Ramadi, or that 3 years ago a woman in a tan uniform had carried him through a corridor with mortar fire scoring the walls like a sculptor with a deadline. The briefing had come the night before she started the job. A quiet conversation in a federal building that wasn't on any public maps. A woman in a grey suit who'd explained that a specific individual would be admitted to St. Michael's at some point in the next 8 months. Her mission was simple: remain embedded as routine hospital staff. Monitor for signs that the classified exposure that had resulted in his evacuation had reached the wrong ears. Watch for a particular physician who might attempt to gain access, someone with ties to organizations interested in finishing what the improvised explosive device had started. Stay invisible. Stay in place. Stay quiet. If he recognizes you, the woman had said, the entire operation is compromised. He won't, Megan had responded, and that had been the truth. The man in Ramadi had known her. Corporal James Mitchell had known her voice. He'd known her hands. He'd known that when Captain Megan O'Brien said hold on, holding on was the only option that existed. But the man in room 347 with the hollow eyes and the healing brain. That man didn't know anything. The IED had seen to that. She took his vitals at 8:15 a.m. Blood pressure 118/72, steady. Heart rate 64, regular. Respiratory rate 16. His oxygen saturation held at 97% on room air. All the numbers were fine. All the measurements indicated a body that was healing, a physical form that would likely recover full functionality if it didn't have the minor complication of a mind that couldn't quite hold onto things. She worked efficiently, speaking in the soft, professional tone she used with all conscious patients. He didn't respond. He watched her with those vacant eyes, as if she were a phenomenon he couldn't quite explain, something interesting but ultimately irrelevant to whatever small corner of consciousness he was capable of accessing at present. The faded unit patch was tucked inside her jacket lining. 3 centimeters by 4, sewn into the fabric where it wouldn't move or shift or accidentally fall out during a 12-hour shift. The emblem of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse, the unit she'd been attached to during the deployment in 2021. She'd sewn it in herself, early morning in her apartment before the job started, her fingers moving with muscle memory through the motions of stitching it down. Some things you don't leave behind, even when the mission requires you to pretend you didn't exist. Dr. Pierce arrived at 9:22 a.m. She knew the exact time because the clock on the wall had just ticked past it when she felt his presence materialize in the hallway, the way you sometimes feel a change in air pressure before a storm actually breaks. He moved through the unit with the kind of casual authority that came from having built systems you could exploit, systems that very few people paid close attention to until the moment those systems started to matter. He stopped at the desk where she was completing her medication reconciliation, his shadow falling across her paperwork like something that had weight and temperature. Captain O'Brien, he said, and she didn't correct him about the rank because there was nothing in her official file that would tell him she'd ever held a rank above nurse. He'd said it the way someone might say a name they'd looked up and weren't sure about, testing it out to see if it felt wrong. I'd like to discuss your approach to patient documentation. I think you might be overly complicated it. She looked up from the chart. Met his eyes with the kind of sustained eye contact that most people found uncomfortable. Took one measured breath. "I'm following protocol exactly," she said, her voice quiet, steady as a resting heart rate. "Every medication, every equipment charge, every procedure documented with verifiable timestamps. Nothing complicated about it." The room went dead silent. From room 347, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm. From somewhere in the distance, a stretcher's wheels squeaked against tile. Dr. Pierce's jaw moved slightly, a small muscle working beneath the skin. "Well," he said, and something in his voice had shifted to a register that suggested he understood, at some deeper level, that he was speaking to someone who was not going to be shaken by implications or authority. "Let's make sure your documentation doesn't start creating problems for other people. Hospitals operate on trust. Sometimes too much attention to detail can look like suspicion." He walked away without waiting for a response. Megan returned to her work. Her hands did not tremble. Her breath remained even. In room 347, Chief Petty Officer James Mitchell slept with the kind of absolute absence that came from a mind that had forgotten how to stay awake. She would watch him. She would document his recovery. She would remain invisible. And she would protect him from whatever threat had necessitated embedding a captain in a Navy SEAL's hospital room in the first place, all while pretending to be someone whose biggest concern was proper medication timing and equipment reconciliation. The mission had begun. Dr. Pierce just didn't know it yet. The hallway outside room 347 had the sterile smell of antiseptic and stale coffee. Dr. Pierce stood with his arms crossed, his tailored white coat catching the fluorescent light like a predator's teeth. The Martinez family huddled near the doorway, mother, father, teenage daughter, watching the doctor with the kind of trust people reserve for men in positions of authority. Megan was finishing the medication administration record when Pierce's voice cut through the corridor like a surgical blade. "Captain O'Brien." He didn't use her rank as a courtesy. He used it like a slur. "Perhaps you'd care to explain to the Martinez family why their son received his electrolyte replacement 17 minutes past the prescribed window." Megan turned. Her hands were steady. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in that particular hospital frequency that never quite felt natural. She'd been in worse. Remedy at dawn. IED concussions that rearranged your skull. The sound of a man's last breath. A medication timing variance was not a crisis. The fall line was infiltrated, Megan said. Her voice was level, instructional. "I documented the obstruction at 9:43. Replace the line at 10:02. Medication administered at 10:19. The delay was necessary and appropriate." Infiltrated. Dr. Pierce turned to the Martinez family, widening his eyes. Convenient diagnosis. Or did the infiltration happen to occur right after you took your extended break? The mother's face shifted. Doubt. Fear. The precise tool Pierce wielded every time. "I took a 7-minute break," Megan said. The patient was stable. The infiltration was visible upon assessment. For infiltrations compromise medication delivery and require line replacement. Pierce stepped closer. His cologne, something expensive that smelled like money, invaded the space between them. "You know what I see?" A nurse so focused on her own schedule that she nearly delayed critical treatment. A nurse the family should be concerned about. He turned back to them, his smile full of white teeth. "But I'm here now. The line is fine. Your son will be fine. That's what matters." The daughter looked away. The father's jaw tightened. Megan met Pierce's eyes. One breath. Measured. She let a single tear escape, not from fear, not from shame, but from the precision of being understood. She wiped it without breaking his gaze. "I followed every regulation to the letter. And you know it." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Pierce turned away, shoulders stiff, his walk suggesting a man unaccustomed to being contradicted. The Martinez family remained motionless, caught in the crossfire of authority and doubt. Megan returned to the medication cart, her hands moving with mechanical precision, documenting every detail with extra notation, patient status stable. Family present. Concern raised regarding timing. All interventions medically justified. Timestamp, 10:23 a.m. The break room was designed by someone who'd never actually taken a break. Beige walls. A refrigerator that hummed like a trapped animal. A microwave that smelled like burnt popcorn from 3 days ago. Megan sat at the small table with her lunch, turkey sandwich, apple, yogurt, at 12:48 p.m. The room had been full 5 minutes earlier. Now it was just her and the fluorescent hum. Sandra from the day shift stood in the doorway, lunch bag in hand. She saw Megan, adjusted her course, and left. No greeting. No excuse. Just the decision that Megan O'Brien's presence at this table meant Sandra's lunch would happen elsewhere. Then Jennifer, who'd been friendly for the first 6 months, gathered her things without making eye contact. Maria looked at Megan, then at Sandra's empty seat, then followed them out. The message was cellular. Viral. A shared understanding that proximity to Megan O'Brien had become a liability. Megan bit her sandwich. It tasted like cardboard. She'd eaten worse. She'd eaten field rations under mortar fire with her team circled around her in the dark. She'd eaten nothing for 43 hours waiting for extraction. A lunch alone was not hardship. But it was a message. The hospital had developed an immune system, and she was the infection Dr. Pierce had taught it to reject. She finished eating at 13:06, washed her container, dried her hands with a paper towel that felt like sandpaper. The bathroom mirror showed her a woman with steady eyes and damp palms. She wiped the palms on her scrubs. Composure was not the absence of feeling. Composure was feeling everything and choosing what the world would see. The unit board was posted at the nurse's station, visible to everyone rotating through day shift, evening shift, night shift. A notice with official hospital letterhead and Dr. Pierce's signature. Megan read it at 14:22 p.m., her eyes moving across the words with the same detachment she'd applied to casualty reports. Fabricated. Every word of it. The medication timing had been medically justified. The 4-line assessment had been textbook. The patient safety risk was manufactured. But the document was official. Posted. Witnessed. She read it once. Didn't look away. Didn't let anyone see her reading it. Just noted the timestamp, the phrasing, the specific language that would sound damning to anyone without medical context. That evening, alone in her apartment at 19:43 p.m., Megan opened a blank notebook with lined pages. She had learned documentation in the field, casualty reports, after-action reviews, evidence logs. She applied the same precision now. She wrote with methodical precision, the way she'd written intelligence reports for officers who needed clean facts. Everything dated. Everything sourced. Every contradiction flagged. If Pierce was building a case against her, she would build one against him. Not out of anger. Out of necessity. Her daughter wouldn't understand that yet. Tonight, Emma was asleep in the next room, having spent her evening watching cartoons and asking when Mommy had more time to play. Time. The one resource that disappeared the moment you put on a uniform, medical or military. The one thing her mission kept from both of them. Megan closed the notebook and placed it in the back of her desk drawer, beneath old bank statements and insurance documents. Protection. Evidence. Insurance that if Pierce's next move came, she would have documentation. The faded unit patch in her jacket lining, hidden in the locker, felt heavier somehow. She'd worn it through Ramadi. Through the rescue. Through the evacuation. It was supposed to be dormant now, part of the cover. Part of the nurse identity that was supposed to be her entire world for the duration of the mission. But missions could be compromised by men like Dr. Pierce. Missions could be destroyed by bureaucratic knives wrapped in official letterhead. And sometimes, the people protecting you had to fight for you first. The morning shift was beginning. Megan's scrubs were clean. Her documentation was complete. Her composure was rebuilt, layer by layer, the way engineers rebuild structures after explosions. Dr. Pierce was still orchestrating his symphony of humiliation and doubt. He just didn't know she was composing a counter-melody. The alarm started at 2:53 a.m. 3 short bursts, high-pitched, relentless, the kind that pierced through the industrial hum of the third floor and made every nerve-ending snap to attention. Megan was running a routine vitals check on room 347, the SEAL still breathing steady through the night, his monitor tracing the gentle rhythm of a man finally at rest. She checked his blood pressure at 244. Normal. Oxygen saturation at 98%. Heart rate steady at 68. Everything textbook. Then the machine screamed. His monitor went chaotic in less than 3 seconds. The rhythm fragmented into wild electrical chaos, ventricular fibrillation, the heart spasming instead of beating, doing nothing but burning energy. No pulse. No perfusion. Brain death in 4 minutes. Cardiac death in 6. Megan didn't hesitate. She didn't call for help. She didn't wait for the code team. Her body knew what her mind couldn't articulate. Muscle memory took over. The same muscle memory that had saved lives in the scorching streets of Ramadi under mortar fire, the same instinct that had kept her hand steady when every rational part of her screamed to freeze. She moved toward the crash cart like her bones were iron rails and gravity was the only law. A 14-gauge needle. Betadine swab across his anterior chest. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The exact coordinates of the gap between his ribs where a scalpel becomes a lifeline. She pulled a surgical scalpel from the crash tray, not standard emergency procedure, not what the hospital protocol manual authorized, not what Dr. Pierce had ever witnessed in his 23 years of carefully managed medicine. The blade caught the fluorescent light for 1 microsecond as she made the incision. Clean. Deep. Decisive. Through skin. Through fascia. Through the pleura. The hiss of air escaping from the chest cavity filled the room like a whispered curse. His left lung deflated as the pressure released. She opened the pericardium, the membrane surrounding the heart, and her hands found the organ the way a pilot finds the horizon. Warm. Slick. Still. She began chest compressions, but not the external kind taught in certification courses. These were internal. Direct. Her fingers encircling the SEAL's heart, feeling for the moment it would remember how to beat, pressing with the kind of controlled force that came from understanding human anatomy not as theory but as survival. What the hell is she doing? Someone's voice from the doorway. Dr. Chen, the overnight resident. His face the color of drywall. Megan didn't answer. Didn't acknowledge. Didn't blink. Her focus had collapsed to a single point, the organ between her fingers and the electrical impulse that needed to restart. The monitor's still screaming. Stop. You need to stop. Chen moving toward her. The kind of movement of someone who'd never held a life in their hands and felt it slip. No. One word. Not a request. It was a command. Her voice dropped an octave, the civilian accent gone, replaced by something that made Chen stop mid-stride. Something that made every nurse still in the hallway freeze. Epi. 1 milligram. For push. Now. The crash cart nurse, Perry, a first year, moved without thinking. The syringe was in her hand, the medication running through the fall line before her brain caught up to what her body was doing. How did she know to move? How did she know this nurse, the one everyone called the quiet one, was actually giving orders that needed to be followed? Because authority isn't something you announce. It's something you become. Megan's hands kept working. Gentle. Purposeful. No panic. No wasted motion. Just a woman who had been trained by the finest military medicine that money and loss could buy, who had learned her craft in conditions where there was no waiting for ambulances, no backup, no net. Just you and a human body and 60 seconds to decide if someone's kid was going to have a father. Sinus rhythm. Perry's voice, Barely a whisper. The first normal heartbeat in 90 seconds. The monitor transitioned from the wild screaming to a steady beep. 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 The rhythm of a living heart. O2 sat. Megan's voice, controlled as a metronome. 68. She felt the lung re-expanding under her hands as she adjusted her position. Aspirate the fluid. 14-gauge needle. Pneumothorax kit. Perry was moving. The other nurses were moving. They didn't know why they were listening to someone without a doctor's title, without hospital credentials beyond the laminated badge that identified her as Megan O'Brien, RN, but they were moving anyway. Because competence is contagious. Because the room had shifted. Because the timid nurse who'd eaten lunch alone for 8 months had just become someone else entirely. 72, Perry called out. Climbing. The SEAL's chest rose and fell on its own. His body remembered how to breathe. 81% oxygen saturation. The numbers climbing like a fever breaking. 88. 92. Stable. Megan's hands were covered in blood up to her wrists. Her scrubs were soaked through in 3 places. Her hair had slipped from its ponytail and fell against her cheek, and she wiped it with the back of her hand, leaving a crimson streak across her face like war paint. She stepped back from the bed slowly, her breathing controlled, her movements still fluid, still precise. The SEAL's chest rose and fell with the ventilator, his heart maintaining its new rhythm without argument. His pupils reactive. His oxygen saturation steady at 94%. Alive. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Pierce, who'd arrived at the chaos like a man walking into a building he thought he owned only to find someone else had changed the locks. He stood in the doorway of room 347, his mouth open the way a fish's mouth opens after it's been pulled from water. Around him, the entire 3rd floor had abandoned their posts. Nurses. Techs. A respiratory therapist who'd been on her break. 37 people crammed into the hallway, pressing against the observation window, watching a woman whose file read as 8 months employed, competent but unremarkable, perform a procedure that belonged in an operating room under general anesthesia with a full surgical team. Dr. Pierce's hands were shaking. What have you done? His voice cracked like old paint. That's a felony. That's unauthorized surgical intervention. That's grossly exceeding scope of practice. Hospital Regulation 7.3.2 explicitly forbids. His heart had stopped. Megan turned to face him. She wasn't defensive. Wasn't panicked. Just factual, the way someone describes the weather. 91 seconds of ventric fib. Brain death in 4 minutes. Cardiac death in 6. I was here. No physician was. You're not a physician. No, Megan agreed. She looked at her hands, at the blood coating them like evidence, like testimony. I'm not. Dr. Chen was reviewing the monitor data, his face cycling through shock to something that looked like professional respect. Her technique was textbook. He looked up at Megan with new eyes. That was a field thoracotomy. That's military medicine. The hallway went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical exhale. Perry was staring at Megan's forearms, where the sleeves of her scrubs had ridden up during compressions. The girl's face went pale. Captain, Perry whispered. Just that single word. Captain. But Megan was already moving toward the supply room, stripping off her contaminated gloves, running her bloody hands under the sink. The water turned red, then pink, then clear. She didn't look at Dr. Pierce. Didn't look at the hallway of shocked faces. Didn't acknowledge what Perry had just called her, what the blood on her hands testified to, what every person now standing in that hallway had just witnessed. She just kept washing, methodical and thorough, the way someone washes away evidence of a life saved by breaking every rule that was supposed to matter. Within 1 hour of the SEAL stabilizing, Dr. Pierce's footsteps echoed down the locker room corridor. He moved with the precision of a man executing a plan he'd rehearsed 100 times in his head, methodical, unhurried, the kind of deliberate calm that comes from knowing you hold institutional power like a weapon. He knew exactly which locker was hers. Bay 7. Third row. The lock gave way to the master key all department heads carried, a small brass thing that opened doors meant to stay closed. The jacket hung on the interior hook, navy blue scrub jacket with a faded hospital logo on the breast. He ran his fingers along the seams, checking pockets with the thorough precision of someone searching for contraband. Nothing. No diary, no personal effects, no evidence of the military background that had somehow made her superhuman in a crisis. He pulled the jacket toward the light, examining the lining where scraps of thread suggested something had been there once, removed, hidden, or worn so thin it had simply disintegrated. Then his fingers caught something. A seam that didn't match the others. He worked his nail along the edge, felt the fabric split under gentle pressure, and withdrew a patch no bigger than a business card. Faded olive drab cloth with a unit emblem, crossed anchors and a trident, letters so worn they were barely legible. He turned it over twice, decided it was vintage memorabilia, the kind of thing nurses kept to remember dead relatives or romantic notions about military service. He dropped it back inside the jacket lining and left it there, already composing the termination paperwork in his head. By 2:15 p.m., Dr. Pierce had filed the report. Hospital Regulation 7.3.2 was clear and unambiguous. Nurses shall not perform invasive surgical procedures without direct physician supervision and explicit authorization. The document ran 4 pages. Unauthorized surgical procedure, he wrote. Grossly exceeding scope of practice. Potential liability exposure estimated at $4.7 million. Disciplinary history attached. He attached the fabricated write-up from the break room, photocopied it twice, and hand-delivered both copies to the HR office on the 2nd floor. This one needs to move fast, he told Rebecca from Human Resources, a woman who owed him 3 favors from his tenure on the hospital board. She's a liability. You want to wait until she kills someone doing something outside her lane. Rebecca didn't ask questions. She never did. The phone call came at 2:38 p.m. Ms. O'Brien, we need you in HR immediately. Not a request. A command. Megan knew. The moment she heard the tone, clipped, official, carrying the weight of predetermined conclusions, she knew the mission was finished. She'd blown her cover. She'd violated the cardinal rule of deep operations: never reveal yourself, no matter the cost. You protect the asset. You complete the objective. You don't let emotion override doctrine. And she'd done exactly that. Saved the SEAL's life. Lost her cover. Compromised the investigation into whoever had tried to kill him in the first place. The walk to HR took her past the 3rd-floor nursing station. 3 of her colleagues looked up from their charts. One of them, Janet, the one who'd been kind to her during the first month, made eye contact and then looked away. The message was clear. Contagion. Don't be seen with her. The meeting lasted 14 minutes. Rebecca sat behind the desk with our medical director, a man named Cassidy who'd clearly been briefed on every detail Pierce had invented. They didn't accuse. They didn't argue. They presented the narrative as fait accompli: unauthorized procedure, scope violation, liability risk, immediate termination effective immediately. Megan listened to the words wash over her the way she'd been trained to absorb combat orders, without facial expression, without the tremor of fear or regret. She'd been terminated from better positions than this. She'd ended operations in Baghdad with nothing but a phone number written on her palm. She'd walked out of a CIA safe house in Beirut with 48 hours warning and a new name. This was protocol. This was the cost. I understand, she said. We'll need your badge and your access credentials, Rebecca said, sliding a manila envelope across the desk. Megan removed her hospital badge, the one that said Megan O'Brien, RN, St. Michael's Hospital, and placed it gently on the desk. The laminate caught the fluorescent light. Her photo stared back at her from the badge, a woman in professional clothing who didn't exist anymore. She'd been useful for 8 months. Now she was a security risk. Your final paycheck will be mailed to the address on file, Cassidy said. 2-week severance per the employment agreement. You may not enter the hospital without express written permission from the director. She turned in her access card. Signed the separation agreement without reading it. Watched them staple her employment file closed. The locker room was empty at 3:22 p.m. She opened her locker, bay 7, third row, and found the jacket hanging exactly as she'd left it. She packed the minimal things she'd accumulated, a pair of compression socks, a cold compress, a photo of her daughter from September that she'd kept in a zippered pocket. The Navy SEAL Challenge coin she'd carried for 12 years stayed in her scrub pocket. The faded unit patch still lived in the jacket lining where Dr. Pierce had failed to recognize what it represented. She dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a grey pullover that smelled like her own laundry, not hospital detergent. Her hands moved methodically, pulling on shoes, zipping the locker, checking the area to ensure she left no trace. Protocol. Always protocol. The drive home took 24 minutes. She sat at 3 red lights, staring at nothing, calculating what came next. Her clearance was blown. Her cover was finished. The physician they'd sent her to watch had seen her at her most exposed, performing combat medicine in a civilian hospital where combat medicine wasn't supposed to exist. Everything she'd been tasked to do had been hollowed out by the simple fact of saving a man's life. Her daughter was home by 3:38 p.m., the door opening with the particular violence of a 7-year-old who didn't understand why school had ended at the usual time, but Mommy was there waiting in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her hands folded, staring at nothing. Mommy. The word came soft and confused, the way children speak when they sense the world has tilted on its axis and they don't have the vocabulary to understand. Why are you home? It's not sick day. Megan looked at her daughter, brown hair pulled back in a crooked ponytail that the school caregivers had attempted and failed to maintain, and felt the weight of every choice she'd made compressed down into a single moment. The kitchen smelled like the pine cleaner she used on Thursdays. Rain hammered against the window in the steady rhythm that meant the weather systems were shifting, pressure dropping, storms moving in from the Gulf. Mommy lost her job today, she said. Her daughter's face went very still. She understood, in the way children understand things, that this mattered. That this was bad. That the normal architecture of her life, Mommy goes to the hospital, Mommy comes home, they eat dinner, Mommy reads bedtime stories, had developed a hairline fracture. Are we okay? The question was so small it barely made it across the table. Are we going to be okay? Megan reached for her daughter's hand, but the gesture caught on something inside her, some loop of doubt, some opening in the armor that she'd spent 18 years building, reinventing, and defending. The room suddenly felt very small. The rain sounded louder. And for the first time since Ramadi, since the medic lieutenant had given her the unit patch and whispered, "You're going places, O'Brien," she wondered if she'd been wrong. If all the sacrifice, all the hidden years, all the compartments of her life that existed in watertight sections with no overlap, no connection, no witnesses, if it had all been for nothing. She'd failed the primary objective. The terrorist-linked physician had been on that floor. He'd seen her. He knew exactly who and what she was now. And her daughter was asking if they were going to be okay, which meant her daughter had absorbed the possibility that they might not be. Megan sat in the kitchen at 3:51 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon while rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and she felt something inside her want to break. Not physically, her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, her posture unchanged. But internally, in that small place where soldiers keep the things they can't say out loud, something fractured. She pulled out the unit patch from her jacket pocket. Held it on her palm. The emblem was barely visible now, worn nearly smooth by years of being carried in different uniforms, different continents, different lifetimes. She could see how someone like Dr. Pierce would dismiss it. Memorabilia. Sentiment. Attachment to a past that didn't matter in a hospital in Atlanta where billing systems and power dynamics and 14-minute termination meetings determined who got to stay and who got erased. For exactly 4 seconds, she considered letting it drop. Letting it fall to the kitchen floor. Letting it stay there while she made tea and tried to explain to her daughter that everything would be fine, we'll find another job, we'll be okay, the scripts people said to children when they were lying. Then she heard it. Distant. Coming from somewhere beyond the rain and the city noise and the ordinary afternoon. A low rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat scaled up to monstrous size. Rotors. Aircraft. Multiple units, moving fast, flying low enough that the sound cut through the rain and vibrated the windows in their frames. Megan's head came up. Her entire physiology shifted. The unit patch closed in her fist. Her daughter heard it too, asked "What's that?" with the innocent confusion of a child who'd never heard a helicopter moving at combat speed through American airspace. "Someone coming home," Megan said quietly. The rotor wash grew louder. There was more than one. 3, maybe 4. Coming from the direction of Fort Stewart, flying in formation, which meant priority movement, which meant someone had made a call. Someone who'd been waiting. Someone who'd known what would happen the moment a certain Navy SEAL woke up and recognized a face he'd been trained never to forget. She held the patch tighter. Outside, Atlanta rain fell in sheets, and somewhere in the wet city above them, helicopters carved through the storm toward a hospital on the east side of town. Megan stood up slowly, kept her daughter's hand in hers, and waited for the knock that she now understood was coming. The knock came at 6:22 a.m., not on her apartment door but on the hospital's secure line that only 3 people in the building knew existed. Megan stood in her kitchen with her daughter sleeping upstairs, coffee cooling in her hands, watching the sunrise paint Atlanta in shades of amber and ash. The phone rang. She didn't hesitate. She answered. Captain O'Brien. The voice was clipped, military bearing compressed into 2 words. NCIS. We need you back at St. Michael's. Now. The drive took 13 minutes. She left her daughter with a neighbor who didn't ask questions. Some people understood that certain mothers came home with stories they couldn't tell. The parking lot at St. Michael's was already different. 2 black SUVs. Unmarked sedans. Men in suits who carried themselves like they'd spent time in places that didn't have names on maps. Megan walked through the ER entrance past nurses who'd been whispering about her for 8 months and now stared like they were seeing a stranger. Maybe they were. By 8:22 a.m., the hospital's background audit had flagged her classified security clearance in the DOD personnel database. By 9:15, every administrator above Dr. Pierce had received encrypted notifications. By noon, room 347 had transformed into something between a war room and a shrine. A Marine colonel stood beside the SEAL's bed, uniform creased like a knife edge. 2 FBI agents occupied the corner with briefing folders. A 2-star general stood near the window, shoulders broad enough to block the light. They were all here because one nurse had decided that saving a life mattered more than staying invisible. The SEAL opened his eyes, really opened them, clarity flooding his pupils for the first time since his evacuation from Ramadi 3 years ago. His hand moved across the sheets like he was searching for something his brain couldn't quite name. Then his gaze found her. Recognition lit his face like someone had struck a match in absolute darkness. Valkyrie. Her call sign came out as a whisper, hoarse from weeks of sedation. You're Valkyrie. You carried me out. I remember now. I remember your voice. His eyes filled with tears that spilled sideways across his temples. I remember your name. The Marine colonel stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of official record. For extraordinary valor in Ramadi, Captain Megan O'Brien carried 3 wounded personnel under sustained enemy fire to the forward operating base at Charlie Point. Demonstrating exceptional medical knowledge, tactical acuity, and disregard for her own personal safety. The door burst open like someone had kicked it off its hinges. Dr. Pierce stood in the threshold, face mottled red, voice climbing toward a shout. These are unauthorized visitors. HIPAA violations. I'm calling hospital security and my attorney. This ends now. The 2-star general turned. Slowly. Like a ship changing course. When he moved, the entire room seemed to tilt around him. He looked at Dr. Pierce the way a person looks at an insect they've just noticed on their shoe. Then his right arm came up. A salute, crisp and deliberate, executed toward Megan's borrowed uniform where decorations now hung in neat rows, bronze star, silver star, 2 purple hearts, and the Navy Cross positioned at the apex like a crown. "Captain." The general's voice had the quality of a door closing. "This hospital is now under federal jurisdiction regarding patient care and medical records. You are relieved of duty pending investigation." Dr. Pierce's face drained of color like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No sound came out. He tried to back toward the door, but 2 FBI agents who'd been patient in their corner moved with the fluid precision of people who'd done this before. One of them held up a piece of paper, bleached white under the fluorescent lights. "Dr. James Pierce, we have a warrant to examine all documents related to patient billing, equipment charges, and personnel records. We're also executing this warrant for your personal workspace, vehicle, and residence. You're under arrest for attempting to forge federal personnel documents in the Department of Defense database. That's 18 U.S.C. 922, federal jurisdiction, federal penalties." The handcuffs didn't click like they did in movies. They whispered. Metal on metal, soft and final. What happened next was the kind of moment that doesn't make sense until you live it. Dr. Pierce started screaming. Not words, just sound, rage and panic, and the realization that every strategic move he'd calculated, every regulation he'd weaponized, every carefully filed complaint had been nothing but steps toward this exact moment. He thrashed against the agent's grip, knocked over a rolling tray, and his voice cracked like someone breaking in public for the first time. She didn't have the authority. She exceeded her scope. "I have documentation. I have witnesses." She violated protocol. Spittle caught the light. His suit, tailored and expensive 2 hours ago, now looked like it was wearing him instead of the other way around. "This is entrapment. This is a setup." The general didn't blink. The agents didn't hesitate. They walked him toward the door, past the nurse's station where every single staff member stood frozen, watching. The people who'd left the break room when Megan sat down. The ones who'd whispered unstable, incompetent, trouble. Their faces shifted as Dr. Pierce was walked past them in handcuffs, mouth still moving, eyes still searching for something that could save him, a sympathetic face, a friendly witness, some remnant of the authority he'd wielded like a weapon. There was nothing there. Just silent stares. Just recognition. The perp walk continued down the corridor toward the elevators. Megan stood in room 347 with the SEAL's hand gripping hers like he was afraid she'd vanish again. Her hand was steady. Not because she felt steady, but because hands that had held lives together in Ramadi didn't tremble when witnesses were finally being called. Not because she felt steady, but because she'd been trained to translate fear into focus. By 1:33 p.m., the FBI had traced Dr. Pierce's attempt to forge Megan's termination records in the DOD database. By 2:08 p.m., 3 federal prosecutors had been assigned to the case. By 4:15 p.m., he was processed into federal custody pending arraignment. The charges stacked like building blocks: attempt to obstruct federal documents, insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud involving approximately $847,000 in inflated equipment charges over a 3-year period. The offshore accounts were traced by 6:22 p.m. The conspiracy was larger than anyone had suspected. But that wasn't Dr. Pierce's problem anymore. That was the government's problem now. 6 months later, Dr. James Pierce stood behind the counter at a community college CPR classroom, wearing a name tag that read Steve in letters that had started to peel. His hands, which had once signed prescription orders with absolute authority, demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic mannequin to a classroom of people who didn't recognize him as anything but the old guy teaching the recertification course. When students called him doctor, he flinched. The flinch became automatic. The name tag stayed crooked. He'd learned to accept being forgotten by people he'd tried to break. But Megan stood at the window of room 347 watching the sunrise paint Atlanta in shades of gold and rose. The SEAL slept peacefully beside her, his breathing deep and even, the kind of sleep that only comes after nightmares finally release their grip. His right forearm rested across the blanket, and her name was tattooed across his skin in letters that had faded but never disappeared, Valkyrie, in script that looked almost like a blessing. She'd carried him through fire once. Now she was carrying him through recovery. The faded unit patch from her jacket, the one Dr. Pierce had found and dismissed as memorabilia, now hung framed on the wall in clear acrylic. The edges were still worn. The colors still faded. But beneath it, a brass plate read, Captain Megan O'Brien, 3rd Battalion 5th Marines, Dark Horse. Ramadi, Iraq. 2019 to 2021. Every time the SEAL woke up, every time he looked at that wall, he remembered. The memories had come back slowly, like film developing in chemical solution, blurry at first, then sharp, then undeniable. He remembered her voice. He remembered her hands. He remembered being saved. The hospital board had issued a statement at 9 a.m. that morning. All billing practices would be audited by an independent third party. A new trauma wing would be established with pro bono care for active duty military and veterans. Dr. Pierce's position had been permanently eliminated. The board chair had called Megan into his office and offered her the title of Director of Trauma Services, Corner Office, Administrative Staff, 5-figure raise, the works. She'd listened to the entire offer. Then she'd shaken her head. I need to be in the room. Her voice had the texture of someone who'd made this decision years ago, not moments before. Where the patients are. Not behind a desk. By 7:38 a.m. the following Monday, Megan was back in scrubs, the same ones she'd worn for 8 months while pretending to be less than she was. The nurses who'd abandoned her in the break room found their eyes sliding past her in the corridor, unable to hold her gaze. The ones who'd questioned her competence now asked her opinions in careful, tentative voices. She answered them without anger or vindication, just clarity. Just facts. Just the tone of someone who'd already survived worse than their judgment. She'd been assigned as the SEAL's long-term care coordinator, a position that didn't technically exist before that morning, created specifically because sometimes the bravest thing an institution can do is change its structure to honor the people who've changed it. She could be his nurse. She could be his physical therapist coordinator. She could be his voice when he needed one. But most importantly, she could be present. Not hidden. Not invisible. Just there, every day, in scrubs, checking vitals, writing notes, doing the work that nobody remembered and everyone depended on. On the 3rd Thursday of her new assignment, the SEAL was discharged. Not to a facility. To a small apartment in Midtown that the Navy had arranged, with modifications for his recovery. Megan drove him there in the late afternoon, and when she pulled into the parking lot, he looked at her with eyes that finally recognized everything, the sacrifice, the years of waiting, the moment she decided that his life mattered more than her cover. You stayed, he said. Not a question. A statement of fact that had taken 3 years and a cardiac arrest to articulate. I stayed, she confirmed. She walked him to his apartment door, checked the setup the Navy had arranged, confirmed he had her number programmed into his phone. And then she did something she hadn't allowed herself to do for 3 years. She let him see her smile. Not the professional smile of a nurse. The real one. The one that existed behind the armor. The one that had been waiting for him to remember. When she got back to the hospital at 5:06 p.m., the ER was chaos, a multi-vehicle accident on I-75, 3 critical traumas rolling in on stretchers, attending physicians calling out orders like they were conducting an orchestra. Megan moved through the controlled violence of the trauma bay with the kind of grace that only comes from having done it before, carrying equipment, anticipating needs, her hand steady as someone drawing blood from stone. A young resident looked at her mid-crisis. Captain, should we? She cut him off with 2 words. Push epi. He pushed it. The monitor responded. The patient stabilized. And in that moment, the entire trauma bay understood what the general had understood. What the SEAL had finally remembered. What the nurses were beginning to realize. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of power that lived in quiet hands. The kind of strength that asked for nothing but was everything when it was needed. Scars tell stories. Hers told of Ramadi and Atlanta, of fire and recovery, of choosing to be seen instead of staying hidden. Sometimes the greatest victories don't come from staying in the shadows. They come from stepping into the light and fighting for what matters most, not with weapons or rank or authority, but with steady hands and a refusal to let anyone define who you are. Do you have someone in your life who's been underestimated because of their position, their uniform, or the work they do? Someone whose real strength exists in quiet moments when nobody's watching? Subscribe for more stories about people who change the world not through headlines, but through heartbeats. Hit like. Leave a comment with your story. And remember, the bravest warriors don't always carry guns. Sometimes they carry stethoscopes.